I believe you all here in Lodi were tuned into the webcast last week, and I know Mr. Register referred to his first Passover, first time keeping the Passover after being baptized. And we can all probably relate and remember that, those of us who are baptized members coming in and kind of solemn, somber mood, a little bit different than what we're used to. And it's a different kind of night, isn't it? Different kind of event with our brethren. I remember my first time, which was also my wife's first. We had a number of big changes that year. We got married, then got baptized, finished college, moved to a new city. So we were a couple months in to a new congregation at that point. This was in Sacramento at the time. We didn't know anyone really that well. It was just a different feeling with these people who, of course, we loved and were friendly, but we just didn't know anyone very well in this quiet mood walking in. Everyone down, right, sitting quietly, noses in their Bible, getting themselves ready. We didn't really know what to expect. But as Mr. Register was talking about that, I was reminded of something else a little bit different, which wasn't too many years before that. That was my first night to be much observed coming in, and I didn't quite know what to expect there. I'd been to Holy Day services in the Church of God before, been to a number of Sabbath services, but I didn't quite know what it was going to be. Thought maybe it was going to be something like a Passover Seder, something a little bit more formal. Where was our congregation up in, I believe, in a restaurant in Red Bluff. And it was a wonderful night, wonderful setting, but as I said, I just didn't know what to expect. But as I thought a little bit about this, I did some research about what takes place in a Passover Seder. What I thought might be the case there. And again, I was corrected. But in almost 3 weeks, on April 15th, the night when we're keeping Night to be Much Observed, millions of people around the world, Jewish people, will gather together in their homes with their extended families, with their friends, to keep a Passover Seder. And it's much more than a dinner together. It's a religious service. It's heavily scripted. There's a lot of symbolism to teach the story of the Passover, including the plagues, and the Exodus from Egypt. There's specific foods that they eat. Some of us have seen the Passover plates. It kind of reminds me of the lunch cafeteria trays with the different divided sections, and you see them with, I think, there's 7 around, and one in the center with pictures of different foods on there sometimes. But there's specific foods eaten in a specific order at a specific time. Each symbolizes an aspect of the Israelites gaining their freedom, which was done by the grace of God. And looking into the symbolism, as I looked at it, I noticed something that was very interesting that surprised me, and that not all Jewish groups agree quite on what the symbolism of the unleavened bread is. Which is shocking. We all are very familiar, right? We talk about it and kind of beat it into our heads. I think any of the kids here can probably tell us that the leavening represents sin, right? But here's some examples of what some say the unleavened bread symbolizes. Obviously, they all note that the bread didn't have time to rise. The dough didn't rise when they left Egypt because it was in haste, right? But there's a lot of different ideas. Some say it's the bread of the poor. It's the bread that would have been given to the Israelites in Egypt because they were slaves. They didn't get the good stuff. And then they appropriated it as a symbol of their resilience, their resistance to the captors. Others say it's meant to represent the opposite of the leavened bread of the Egyptians. Some sources will tell us that Egypt was the birthplace of leavened bread. Others claim that breaking the matzah, we're all familiar with how that dry piece of matzah breaks in half, that as they break it and make a show of it, it symbolizes the parting of the Red Sea. One that is a little bit hard to wrap my head around had to do with the crumbs. Now, we're all familiar with that traditional matzah that we get. I don't know if any of you bake it. I never have. I've always bought it. But it's crumbly, right? It gets crumbs everywhere. And those crumbs, as you break it and those crumbs fling out across the table, That those crumbs are meant to represent, according to one theory, the particles of oppression, is what it said. The difficulty of getting rid of the remnants of their slavery, right? You can't, just like we talk about the trouble in getting all the leavening out of our homes and out of our lives. I've got an article here written a few years ago, and I did a version of this message a few years ago, by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. An article about what the matzah means in the Passover Seder. The rabbi writes, Passover, the Jewish festival of freedom, is an extraordinary testimony to the power of ritual to keep ideals and identity alive across the centuries. On Passover, we relive the story of our people, sitting together at home as an extended family, as if we were back in the Egypt of the pharaohs on the night before we were about to go free after a long exile and harsh enslavement. We begin the drama by holding up the matzah, the dry, unleavened bread that's one of the key symbols of the festivals, and saying, this is the bread of affliction. That is one of the key symbols of the festivals, and saying, this is the bread of affliction our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Then a child, usually the youngest in the room, asks a series of questions about why is this night different than all other nights? The rest of the evening is largely dedicated to answering those questions, retelling the story of the Exodus together, with acts of eating and drinking that include the bitter herbs of suffering, the wine of freedom. Like I said, every bit of it represents something. He continues, it's a history made memory by reenactment. For most Jews, it's the way we learned when we were young, who we are and why. It also has hidden depths. I've always been puzzled by the two features of the evening, he says. The first is the conflict between the two explanations of the unleavened bread. At the beginning of the story, we call it the bread of affliction. Later on in the evening, though, we speak of it as the bread of freedom they ate as they were leaving Egypt in such a hurry they couldn't wait for the dough to rise. He says, which is it, I used to wonder, a symbol of oppression or of liberty? And I think the answer to the rabbi's question lies in really what they're commemorating, what they're celebrating on that night. Turn with me to book of Exodus. We're going to look at the Passover. Exodus chapter 12. Exodus 12, verse 14. It says, so this day shall be to you a memorial. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast for an everlasting ordinance. That's important, right? That's the command for the Passover, when the instructions for that first Passover are given. Skip down to verse number 42. So in Exodus 12, verse 42. It says, it is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. As I said, that night, April 15th, when we'll be keeping the night to be much observed, this year, millions of people will celebrate the Seder. By their account, they're celebrating the miraculous saving of the Israelites' firstborn, from that 10th plague, that night of the Passover. They're also celebrating the Exodus, leaving Egypt, leaving behind slavery to become a nation, not just a nation, but a nation that is under the leadership of the true God. The problem with this, as we know, these are two separate nights. They represent two separate things. These two passages I read are two separate events. And I was actually asked to explain the timing on this recently, so I thought this would be a good message to give, because we should always be able to explain what we're doing and why. So, again, these are two separate events. Let's back up here. I'm going to turn a page back to Exodus chapter 11. Exodus 11:1. The Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. And those of you who saw the webcast last week, I talked a bit about those plagues. And Pharaoh was, well, I'll sacrifice to your God, but just a little bit, and I won't let you do exactly what you've requested. And finally, we got to the end here, and as it says, he'll surely drive you out of here altogether. Finally, Pharaoh had it enough. Just get out. And that's what happened. Going down to verse 4, Exodus 11:4. Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out to the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits in his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant, who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt, such as there was not like it before, nor shall there be again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue against man or beast, that you may know the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. That's not the first in the plagues that it was pointed out, but there would be a difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites. It's spelled out very clearly in a couple of those. In fact, I'll just point out the livestock disease, the fifth plague. It was told, they shall be set apart. And this is Exodus chapter 9, verse 7. After that happens, Pharaoh sent, and indeed, not even one of the livestock of the Israelites was dead, and the heart of Pharaoh became hard. He did not let the people go. This was told for a reason, that there would be a difference. So the Israelites would know they were set apart. So Pharaoh and the Egyptians would know, and he shows here clearly with the livestock that he checked to verify. And so the world would know. In the seventh plague with the hail, Pharaoh was even given a chance. Represents a chance for all the world. And they're warned, there's a hail coming, bring your livestock in or they'll be killed. And some of the Egyptians listened and some didn't. But going back to the 10th plague, down to Exodus 12, verse 5, instructions on how to keep that Passover. What they should do in order for the Israelites to be protected. Exodus 12:5 says, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or the goats. Now here it tells us, verse 6, you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. So here's where I'm getting to which night are they celebrating and when? What is the timing of that? Now the Hebrew word for twilight here, shall kill it at twilight, means literally in between the two evenings, between sunset and getting dark. We would probably call dusk. Instruction to kill it on the 14th after sunset, so this would be the beginning of the 14th day of the first month. Verse 7, they shall take some of the blood to put it on the doorposts and the lintel of the houses. They shall eat the flesh at night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled with water, but roasted in fire, its head and legs and entrails. Shall let none of it remain until morning. What remains in morning you shall burn. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, sandals on your feet, staff in your hand, so shall you eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So here we're establishing the timeline. It is the Passover to be kept on the day, beginning the evening of the 14th. Verse 12, for it will pass in the land of Egypt at night, will strike the firstborn in the land of Egypt, man and beast. Against all gods of Egypt I will execute judgment, for I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign on the houses where you are. And when you see blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. In verse 14, so this day shall be to you a memorial, this day. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast and by an everlasting ordinance. This is a day, this Passover clearly is a day to be observed and to be kept. Jumping down, verse 21. Moses called to the elders of Israel, said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. You shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. Again, still talking about the same day. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that he shall keep this service. It shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? What does this day mean? Verse 27, you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel of Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. It came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck, on verse 29 now, it came to pass at midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon and the firstborn of the livestock. Verse 30, so Pharaoh rose in the night. He, all his servants and Egyptians, there was a great cry in Israel, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. in the night, still the night of the 14th day. He called for Moses and Aaron by night, "Rise out, go out from among my people and leave." We see then the people packed up, they spoiled the Egyptians, and they left. We don't know exactly the timeline there. I'll fill in the gaps here as we go. But I'm going to go down to verse 40 here. Verse 37 says, "The children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children." So they left. And verse 40 says, "The sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, came to pass that the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt." There is a night to be commemorated for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. So we know that there's a Passover observance. We know there's commemoration for leaving Egypt. When exactly did they leave Egypt? I'm going to back up. I skipped over this deliberately so I can plug the information in here. Exodus 12:15. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. The first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, for whoever eats leavened bread the first day until the 7th day, this person shall be cut off from Israel. The first day shall be a holy convocation. The 7th day shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them. I'm well familiar with what we're talking about, and this is the days of unleavened bread. Verse 17, "So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt." So the first day of unleavened bread, the full feast of unleavened bread, pictures leaving Egypt. As I just read in verse 42, night of observance is this day when you were brought out of Egypt. Now we know clearly from Leviticus 23 that Passover is the 14th day of the first month. First day of unleavened bread is the 15th of the first month. I want to turn to one more verse that makes this distinction very clear. Because again, not everyone can quite wrap their mind around this. Turn with me to Numbers 33:3. Says, "They departed from Ramses," and remember they left Ramses and journeyed to Succoth, as it says in Exodus 12. "They departed from Ramses on the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out in boldness in the sight of the Egyptians." So with that timing in mind, I want to review what happened the day after the 10th plague, the day after the firstborn were killed. So keep in mind, the 14th, beginning of the 14th day after sunset, Israelites killed the Passover lamb, kept the meal together. In Exodus 12:29, back there again, Exodus 12:29 says, "Came to pass at midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt." Verse 30, "So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants and Egyptians. There was a great cry, and not a house where there was not one dead. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and said, 'Rise, go out from among your people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also.'" Be gone. So this is before sunrise on the 14th. You know, it was still dark. Verse 33. "The Egyptians urged the people, 'Please get out,' that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, 'We shall all be dead.'" And this goes hand in hand with the spoiling of them. "We'll give you our stuff. We'll give you our gold and silver if you'll just get out." The people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up on their clothes and shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. It was along that line of thought of, what do I care if I give you my gold and silver? I'll be dead if you stay. Verse 37, "The children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children, we know this journey didn't begin until the 15th, a night when they went out of Egypt, so sometime after the sunset on the 15th. So that meant the Israelites spent the daytime of the 14th, whole day, packing up their belongings, asking the Egyptians for gifts, spoiling them, and then left on the evening, the day when they were brought out of Egypt. And verse 42 says, "It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt." This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for the children of Israel throughout their generations. And that is the night that we so often refer to as the night to be much observed. Doesn't have a name spelled out for us other than a solemn observance, a night to be observed. Some groups say night to be remembered. One of those things, kind of like the what we refer to as the last great day, the eighth day, what's called in Leviticus 23, that eighth day, that last great day of the feast. But regardless, we know that it is to be observed. 2 separate nights, Passover, and then the night to be observed. 2 separate nights for the Israelites and 2 separate nights for us. And I want to clarify something on when this observance is, because the timeline of kept by Jews today has to do with bringing that. Of course, they don't bring the lamb in, but they would make that sacrifice on the 14th, at the end of the 14th, leading into sunset on the 15th for the Passover Seder. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 26. This explanation would confuse many, but the example of when Christ kept the Passover makes it that much more clear. Matthew 26, verse 17. Now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, now keep in mind, this was standard at the time to group the Passover and the days of unleavened bread together, called the Feast of the Passover, the days of unleavened bread, combine it into one long event. The first day, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, "Where do you want us to go to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' They did as he directed, and they prepared the Passover. When evening had come, he sat down with the 12. Now, we don't know just yet here what day that was. But if you turn over to John chapter 19, keep a thumb there in Matthew, because I'm going to reference that. John 19, after Christ was crucified. John 19, verse 31. After his death, it says, "Therefore, because it was the preparation day, the day before the holy day, the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day," was the holy day. "The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, they might be taken away." So we see that Christ clearly showed us he kept the Passover the night, a full 24 hours before or almost 24 hours before the holy day began. He kept it sunset of the 14th. Now I want to point something out. I said keep a thumb there in Matthew 26. Disciples came to him and said, "Where should we prepare to eat the Passover?" They understood what day it was. Verse 19, they did as he directed. Verse 18, they came to a man and they said to him, "Give me a place to keep the Passover." He said nothing. He knew what day to keep the Passover. And I'll point out that there was no accusation given that Christ was giving an instruction to keep the Passover on the wrong day. And that's a little bit of reach, but there is no indication that anyone believed keeping the Passover at this time was incorrect. Now, in my experience, I want to go back. Now that we've kind of ironed out that timing, the rabbi in the article I read mentioned two descriptions of unleavened bread. We have the bread of affliction and the bread of freedom. He said there was always that distinction, that dissonance in his mind. How can it be both? How can it be both? And what came into my mind was the types of unleavened bread that we enjoy, the literal unleavened bread that we enjoy during those feast days. Now, I'm going to say on one hand, I've got matzo, right? We all are well familiar with it. It's bland, it's plain. If you get a box of it and look at the ingredients, flour, water, maybe salt. Some traditions, salt isn't okay either. It's dry, it's crumbly. You kind of need a glass of water with it. The crumbs stick in your mouth. It kind of tastes like cardboard, If this was crumblier, it would be about the same flavor, right? No, it's not all bad. You put some cheese on it. You put some butter on it. I've even found chocolate-covered matzo or some desserts that use it. It's pretty good. But plain matzo by itself, not so great. You can see why Deuteronomy talks about the bread of affliction. And I think that's what it's talking about. But the other type of unleavened bread, and we all are familiar with the unleavened treats, right? We all make them. My wife has a recipe that her grandmother's made for many years that she does every year. Cottage cheese rolls. And these things are mostly butter, and they're so good. And one of those things where, it's a good thing for all of us that they only get made once a year, because frankly, I could not eat those every day, and my doctor wouldn't let me, I'm sure. But right, we've got those special unleavened cakes. We often do pancakes on Sabbath at home because the kids like them. So we do crepes during unleavened bread, special cookies, all kinds of wonderful things. But eating unleavened bread doesn't have to be unpleasant, right? You can see that bread of affliction and the bread of freedom. I kind of related that to those two types of unleavened bread. So, part of the answer, let me read back to just what Rabbi Sachs wrote about it. Let me find his quote. He says, which is it, I used to wonder. No, back up a little bit. Two features of the evening. The first is the conflict between the two explanations of the unleavened bread. He says, at the beginning of the story, we call it the bread of affliction. The beginning of the story, as he tells it. Later in the evening, though, we speak of it as the bread of freedom that they ate as they were leaving Egypt. Which one is it? Well, the answer is in his question. It's both. It is the bread of affliction and the bread of freedom. But what he is celebrating in the Passover Seder is two different events, two different nights. Go to one more example of each. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians 11. And this is the Passover, what Paul wrote, for 1 Corinthians 11:23. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat. This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. This bread, Christ's broken body, is the bread of affliction. It was a sacrifice to us to redeem us from death. Bread of affliction represents the Old Testament and the New Testament Passover, right? The sacrifice of the lamb, the blood put on the doorpost for their protection, and the death of Christ, by which we're saved from certain death. We're just like the blood on the doorpost set them aside from the Egyptians, we're set aside by the blood of Christ from the rest of the world. We go back to Exodus again, in Exodus 13. One more spelling out of the night to be observed. Exodus 13:3. And Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out in the month of Abib. It shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, there's a mouthful, which he swore to his fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and the seventh day shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And you shall tell your son in that day, it's important verse 8, you shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be a sign to you on your hand and a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, beginning with the night to be much observed, is a celebration of freedom. This is the bread of freedom. As 1 Corinthians 5 points out, keep the feast with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Celebration of the gift we were given, the freedom from Egypt, the freedom from slavery, the freedom from sin. The rabbi's question, as I said, which is it? Which symbol is it? And the answer is that it's both. But we need to remember that these are two very distinct, very important events. In just under 3 weeks, like I said, we'll be keeping the night to be much observed. Some of you together or at home with your families or maybe alone, but keeping it nonetheless. The same night, many millions, many more than those of us keeping this command, will be keeping the Passover Seder. But when we keep it, we will have kept previous night the Lord's Passover. Those of us who are baptized members, we will have kept the Lord's Passover as commanded, as instructed, as Christ taught us. Now, Passover is our redemption, and the night to be much observed is a commemoration of our freedom, of our deliverance from sin, of our ability to partake of that bread of freedom, that unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And then we are blessed and fortunate enough to be able to partake of that bread of freedom for 7 full days.